She was mocked for being a seamstress, but when they saw her bank balance, they nearly fainted. Margaret Wilson sighed as she adjusted her reading glasses and turned her attention back to the delicate hem she'd been sewing for the past 3 hours. At 65, her hands were still steady and precise, guiding the fabric through the machine with the skill of someone who had dedicated her entire life to the craft. When the doorbell chimed, she didn't even look up from her work. It was almost 6 in the evening, and she usually only received familiar clients at that hour. "Excuse me, ma'am," said a young, impatient voice. Margaret finally lifted her gaze and saw 3 young people standing at the entrance of her small atelier. 2 guys and a girl, all dressed in expensive clothes with expressions that mixed haste with poorly disguised disdain. "Good evening. How can I help you?" Margaret asked, turning off the machine and removing her glasses. The curly-haired brunette boy stepped forward, holding a bag of clothes. "Look, we need some urgent adjustments on these pieces. They have to be ready by tomorrow morning, got it?" said Tyler, glancing around with an air of superiority. The blonde girl in a beige beret named Amber whispered something to the other guy, Brandon, who stifled a chuckle. Margaret noticed the disdainful looks they exchanged as they eyed her white sewing machine, well-maintained but clearly well-used. "It depends on the type of adjustments," Margaret replied calmly. "May I take a look?" Tyler dumped the clothes onto the work table carelessly. They were expensive designer pieces, some still with tags. "Just shorten some hems, adjust a few necklines. Simple stuff," he said, as if doing her a favor. Amber stepped closer to the machine and made a face. "Wow, this thing must be from the dinosaur era," she remarked to her friends, not caring if Margaret heard. Brandon chuckled under his breath. "At least it works, right? I guess it's what you can afford on a seamstress's salary," he said, looking at Margaret as if she were invisible. Margaret felt heat rise to her face but kept her composure. She'd dealt with people like this before. She picked up each piece one by one, examining the fabrics and seams with a professional eye. "These are nice pieces," she commented, ignoring their snide remarks. "But they'll need special care. This fabric here is very delicate." "Can you do it or not?" Tyler asked, drumming his fingers impatiently on the table. "Because if not, we'll find someone else." "I can, but with this urgency, it'll have to be a premium rate," Margaret said, keeping her tone professional. The 3 exchanged glances. "How much?" Amber asked, clearly expecting a low price. Margaret quickly calculated. The work would take at least 4 hours of dedicated effort, meaning she'd have to work late into the night. $200 per piece. "There are 5 pieces, so $1,000, she said, watching their reactions. Brandon nearly choked. $1,000? For some simple adjustments?" he protested. "The work is for tomorrow morning, on delicate designer fabrics. I'll have to work through the night," Margaret explained patiently. Tyler rolled his eyes. Fine, but make sure it's done well, okay? We don't want it to look like we got it fixed at some—" He cut himself off, but the implication hung in the air. Margaret nodded, accustomed to the lack of respect. "I'll need your contact info to confirm when it's ready," she said, picking up her old phone. "Seriously, you're gonna type it into that?" Amber asked, pointing at the device. "Don't you have a paper planner or something?" "This is more practical," Margaret replied, unlocking her phone. It was then that the notification popped up on the screen, a bank message she hadn't checked since that morning. Her eyes widened slightly at the numbers, but she quickly minimized the notification. However, it was too late. Tyler had leaned in to see the screen, curious about what had caught her attention. His eyes widened when he partially saw the numbers from the bank notification. "Wait a minute," he said, his tone completely shifting. "Did I see that right? What was that amount on the screen?" Margaret quickly slipped her phone into her apron pocket, but realized the damage was done. The 3 young people now stared at her with a mix of confusion and curiosity. "It was just some random notification," Margaret said, trying to change the subject. "Let's focus on the adjustments. Can you give me your contacts?" But Amber had also caught a glimpse of the numbers and urgently whispered something in Brandon's ear, making his eyes widen. "Ms. Wilson," Tyler said, now in a completely different tone, almost respectful. We might have expressed ourselves poorly earlier, and we didn't mean to sound, well, we mean to say we really admire your work, Amber interrupted, suddenly forcing a smile. I bet you have a lot of experience, right? Margaret studied them carefully. The shift in their behavior was too drastic to be a coincidence. They had definitely seen something on her phone screen. I've been in this profession for 40 years, she replied simply. Wow, 40 years, Brandon exclaimed, feigning admiration. You must have built quite a career, huh? Lots of famous clients. Margaret smiled faintly. Now she understood exactly what was happening. A few, she said, offering no details. Tyler tried a more direct approach. Ms. Wilson, we were thinking maybe we could talk about a partnership. We're starting a fashion business and... A partnership? Margaret interrupted, genuinely surprised. Yeah, you know how it is. You have the experience. We have fresh ideas, Amber said quickly. It could be very profitable for everyone. Margaret felt the urge to laugh. 5 minutes ago they were mocking her and her dinosaur of a sewing machine. Now they were talking about a partnership. That's an interesting offer, she said diplomatically. But first I'll finish this job and you can think carefully about whether you really want to team up with a humble seamstress like me. The irony in Margaret's voice didn't go unnoticed, and the three young people exchanged uncomfortable glances. Of course, Tyler said quickly. No rush, we can talk more later. Margaret nodded and turned her attention back to the clothes. Now, let's get your contacts so I can let you know when it's ready, she said, picking up her phone again, this time careful to keep the screen face down. As she wrote down the numbers, Margaret could practically feel the three young people breathing down her neck, clearly trying to sneak another peek at the screen. She suppressed another smile and put the phone away. All set. You can pick them up tomorrow at 7 in the morning, she said. Wouldn't it be possible to have them ready tonight? Tyler asked with exaggerated eagerness. No, I'll be working through the night. 7 a.m. works, doesn't it? Margaret replied firmly. Of course, no problem, Amber said quickly. We'll be back, bright and early. When the three young people left, Margaret finally allowed a smile to spread across her face. She returned to her work table and picked up her phone to properly check the notification that had caused such a stir. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us newcomers out. Now continuing. The amount shown in the notification was indeed impressive. Over $3 million in her checking account, the result of a royalty transfer she had received that morning. But that was just a small fraction of her actual wealth. Margaret sighed and began examining the pieces the young people had left more carefully. They were truly good quality, but the stitching from the designer labels left much to be desired. She had seen far better work done by her former students. As she sorted the garments by the type of adjustments needed, Margaret reflected on how she had gotten there. The daughter of a humble seamstress from Tallahassee, she had learned the craft as a child, sitting at her mother's feet while she worked to support the family. At 18, a unique opportunity had come her way, a scholarship to study haute couture in Paris. She had been the only American accepted into the program that year, thanks to a portfolio she had built with scraps and creativity. The 3 years in Paris had transformed her life. There, she had not only learned advanced sewing techniques, but had also developed her own methods that revolutionized some traditional processes. Her innovations caught the attention of her instructors, who encouraged her to document them and eventually patent some of her discoveries. When she returned to the United States, Margaret was determined to use her knowledge to make a difference. She opened her first atelier in Chicago in the 1980s, but unlike other professionals who sought elite clientele, she kept her prices affordable and accepted all kinds of work. It was during the 1990s that her patented techniques began gaining international industry attention. Major European and American brands started approaching her to license her methods. Margaret was shrewd. Instead of selling the patents outright, she licensed their use in exchange for royalties. Over the years, her techniques spread throughout the global fashion industry. Nearly every major brand used at least one of her patented methods, ensuring a steady stream of income. But Margaret had never sought the spotlight or public recognition. She preferred her simple life, her modest atelier. and the satisfaction of seeing young seamstresses grow professionally. With the royalty money, she had quietly established several sewing schools in underserved communities across the United States, always anonymously. As she prepared her machine to begin the evening's work, Margaret thought about the 3 young people who had just left. It was typical. They mocked those they considered beneath them, but changed their tune completely when financial gain was possible. She had dealt with dozens like them over the years. The difference now was that she had the means to protect herself from opportunists, and more importantly, to help those who truly deserved it. Margaret started with the most delicate dress, a silk piece that needed hem adjustments. As she worked, she wondered if the young people would return just to pick up their clothes, or if they would push further about that supposed partnership. The night passed quietly. Margaret was used to working late, and the steady rhythm of the sewing machine soothed her. Around 11, she paused for tea and checked her phone. There were several WhatsApp voice messages from Ashley, her administrative assistant, who handled the financial aspects of her philanthropic work. One message said, "Ms. Wilson, the paperwork for the new school in Miami is ready for your signature." Another followed. "And we've received confirmation of the final royalty payment from the Italian brand. The amount was higher than expected because of their new collection launch." Margaret smiled. Ashley was one of the few people who knew the full scope of her activities. She had been her student years ago and now helped manage donations and social projects. Another message from Ashley said, "Oh, and the French magazine wants to do a feature on innovative sewing techniques. They don't know the techniques they're researching were created by you, but they're offering a good amount for an interview with American experts. Should I respond?" Margaret typed quickly. "Politely decline. You know I prefer to keep a low profile." She returned to her work, now focused on the second piece, a pair of pants that needed to be taken in at the waist. It was delicate work because the fabric tended to pucker if not handled properly. As she sewed, Margaret reflected on her journey and how she had gotten here. It hadn't always been easy. In the early years after returning from Paris, she had faced a lot of prejudice in the American fashion industry. Many saw her as a small-town seamstress who had been lucky enough to study abroad. It had taken years for her techniques to be recognized and accepted. During that time, she had survived by doing simple alterations and repairs, exactly what she still did today. The difference was that now she chose to do it for pleasure and to stay connected to the roots of her craft. Her marriage to Richard had happened in 1987. He was an engineer and at first didn't understand why Margaret kept her small atelier when she could expand and make much more money. Over time, he came to admire his wife's philosophy of life and supported her social projects. Richard had passed away 5 years ago, a victim of heart trouble. Margaret had cared for him with all her love in his final years, and her decision to live, simply, had allowed them to spend plenty of time together. After his passing, she had found solace in anonymous philanthropy. Every school she opened, every young person who got an opportunity through her projects, made her feel life still had purpose. Around 3 in the morning, Margaret finished the 4th piece. Only one blouse remained, needing its sleeves shortened. Her eyes were tired, but she wanted to finish everything so she could deliver on time the next morning. As she made the final adjustments, she wondered whether she should tell the 3 young people the truth, or let them keep guessing. Experience had taught her it was better to observe people's character before revealing anything about her financial situation. Often, she used these very situations as a test. She invited young professionals to her atelier for small jobs and watched how they treated her. It was an effective way to separate those who deserved her opportunities from the opportunists. At 5 in the morning, Margaret finally finished all the work. The 5 pieces were impeccable, with adjustments that significantly improved their original fit. She folded everything carefully and placed them in protective bags. After a quick shower and a change of clothes, she brewed a strong coffee and sat in her favorite armchair to rest a little before the clients arrived. At 7 on the dot, the doorbell rang. Margaret wasn't surprised to see the 3 young people had arrived right on time. In fact, they seemed to have come a few minutes early and were waiting outside. "Good morning, Ms. Wilson," Tyler said with an exaggerated smile. "Good morning," she replied, noticing they all looked noticeably more put together than the day before. "Did you manage to finish everything?" Amber asked anxiously. "I did. Let me get the pieces," Margaret said, heading to the back of the atelier. When she returned with the bags, the three young people eagerly gathered around. Margaret began showing each piece, explaining the adjustments she had made. "Wow, it's perfect!" Brandon exclaimed, examining one of the pairs of pants. "The fit is so much better than before," Amber agreed, genuinely impressed. "You really know your stuff," said Tyler, and this time the compliment seemed sincere. Margaret nodded professionally. "It's $1,000 as we agreed yesterday," she said. Tyler quickly pulled the money from his wallet, counting the bills carefully. "Here you go," he said, handing it over. "And about that conversation we had yesterday." "About the partnership," Margaret interrupted. "Yeah, we were thinking maybe we could talk more about it. Would you have time today?" asked Amber. Margaret studied them for a moment. "What kind of partnership do you have in mind?" she asked. "Well, we're starting a new brand," explained Brandon. "And we noticed you have a lot of talent. Maybe we could develop some pieces together. And split the profits, of course," Tyler added quickly. Margaret smiled slightly. "And what would you bring to this partnership?" she asked. The three exchanged glances. "We have modern ideas, digital marketing knowledge, connections with influencers," Amber listed. "You'd handle the technical side." "And you think that would be a fair exchange?" Margaret asked calmly. "Of course," Tyler replied quickly. "You provide the craftsmanship, and we handle the strategy." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "It's an interesting proposal," she said, "but I'd need to know more about your work before making a decision." "We can show you our portfolio," Brandon offered, pulling out his phone. "It'd be better if I could see you in action," Margaret said. "How about you come back next week? Then I can observe how you handle a real project." The three agreed enthusiastically and scheduled to return the following Monday. After they left, Margaret watched them go, shaking her head in amusement. She suspected they wouldn't show up on Monday, or if they did, it'd only be to dig deeper into her financial situation. But if they were serious about working, she'd be willing to give them a chance. The weekend passed quietly. Margaret took the time to visit one of her sewing schools in Wicker Park, where she chatted with some students and checked on the progress of the classes. On Monday morning, she arrived at the studio as usual, but this time she was curious to see if the young people would show up. Around 10 in the morning, the bell rang. To her surprise, only one of the three was at the door. Brandon, the dark-haired young man who had been the quietest during their previous conversation. "Hi, Ms. Wilson," he said, looking a little embarrassed. "The others couldn't make it today, but I wanted to talk to you." "Come in," Margaret said, intrigued. Brandon stepped inside and stood in the middle of the studio, clearly nervous. "You're probably wondering why I came alone," he said. "I am curious, yes," Margaret admitted. "It's just, well, I thought a lot over the weekend about our conversation," Brandon began, "and I realized we were really disrespectful to you on Friday." Margaret raised her eyebrows, surprised by his honesty. "I wanted to apologize," he continued. "It wasn't right for us to mock your work and your machine, and then suddenly take an interest just because of, well, what we saw on your phone." "I appreciate the honesty," Margaret said calmly. "The thing is—" Brandon hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "My grandma was a seamstress. She's the one who raised me, actually, and I kind of forgot where I came from when I started working in fashion. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us who are just starting out. Now, back to the story." Margaret sat in her chair, interested in hearing more. "Tell me about your grandma," she said kindly. Brandon smiled for the first time since he had arrived. "Grandma Betty. She lived in Aurora and made clothes for the neighbors. I used to spend afternoons at her house when my mum was working," he said. "She always told me sewing was an art, that every stitch had to be made with care." "Is she still alive?" asked Margaret. "No, she passed away 3 years ago," Brandon said, sadness in his voice. "But before she left, she made me promise I'd never forget my roots." "And do you feel like you've forgotten?" Margaret asked gently. Brandon nodded, ashamed. "When I started working with Tyler and Amber, They always spoke poorly of seamstresses, said it was a thing of the past, and I ended up agreeing, you know, just to fit in. Margaret watched him carefully. There was sincerity in his words and his posture. What changed? She asked. Seeing you work, Brandon replied. The dedication, the precision in the adjustments, and then realizing how wrong we were. It made me remember my grandma and how disappointed she'd be if she saw how I was acting. Margaret stayed silent for a moment, considering his words. And your friends? Have they reflected on this too? Brandon shook his head. Tyler and Amber are more interested in figuring out how you got rich, he admitted. They spent the weekend researching famous seamstresses online, trying to find out who you are. Margaret couldn't help but smile. Did they find anything? No, Brandon said. But that just made them more curious. They think you're hiding some big secret. And you? What do you think? Margaret asked. Brandon looked her straight in the eyes. I think it doesn't matter. You're clearly an amazing professional, and that should be enough. Whether you have money or not, whether you're famous or not, it doesn't change the fact that your work is exceptional. Margaret smiled, impressed by his answer. You know, Brandon, that's a very mature attitude, she said. It reminds me of something my own teacher told me many years ago. What did she say? Brandon asked, curious. That in sewing, as in life, what matters isn't the most expensive fabric or the newest machine. What matters is the dedication and care you put into every stitch, Margaret said. Brandon smiled, and Margaret could see tears forming in his eyes. My grandma used to say the exact same thing, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret stood and walked to a cabinet at the back of the studio. From it, she retrieved an old but well-preserved wooden box. Come here, she said, motioning for Brandon to approach. She opened the box, revealing dozens of old photographs. The first showed a young Margaret standing beside an elegant woman in a luxurious atelier. This was my teacher in Paris, Margaret said, Madame Collins. She taught me that it doesn't matter where you learn or from whom. What matters is what you do with the knowledge. Brandon looked at the photos with admiration. There were images of Margaret at fashion shows, alongside famous models, in elegant studios. You really went to Paris? He asked, amazed. I did, and I learned so much there, Margaret confirmed. But you know what stayed with me the most? Brandon shook his head. It was when I visited a small seamstress in Greenwich Village. She worked in a space smaller than this one, with a machine even older than mine, Margaret said. But the clothes she made were the most beautiful I'd ever seen, because every piece carried her story, her passion. It's like my grandma, Brandon murmured. She didn't have much, but everything she made was perfect. Exactly, Margaret said. And that's what sets a true artisan apart from someone just chasing profit. Brandon looked at Margaret with newfound understanding. You're testing me, aren't you? He asked. This whole partnership talk, watching how we behave. Margaret smiled. I'm very careful about who I let into my professional life, she admitted. I've had too many bad experiences with people who were more interested in what I could offer them than the work itself. And did I pass the test? Brandon asked hopefully. You're passing, said Margaret. But it's not over yet. She closed the photo box and returned to her work table. If you really want to learn from me, you'll have to start from the basics, she said. No partnerships or easy profits. You'd have to work as an apprentice, gaining real experience. Brandon nodded eagerly. I accept. When can I start? Now, said Margaret, pointing to a chair beside her table. I'll teach you how to make a basic stitch the right way. The next few hours flew by. Margaret showed Brandon the fundamentals of hand sewing, watching his dedication and patience. He made mistakes but accepted corrections humbly and tried again. During a lunch break, Brandon asked, Ms. Wilson, can I ask you something personal? Go ahead, she said. Do you really have a lot of money? He asked, then quickly added, not out of nosiness, it's just, well, my grandma always dreamed of meeting a seamstress who had made it in life, as she put it. Margaret considered the question carefully. Brandon, I'll tell you something few people know, she finally said, but I need your word that you won't go spreading it around. You have my word, Brandon said solemnly. Margaret took a deep breath and began explaining her patents, royalties, and the schools she supported. Brandon listened wide-eyed, asking thoughtful questions and showing genuine admiration for her philanthropic work. "My God," he murmured when she finished. "My grandma would lose her mind if she knew I met someone like you." "Your grandma would be proud to see the man you're becoming," Margaret said warmly. "You think so?" Brandon asked, touched. "I'm sure of it," Margaret confirmed. "Now how about we get back to work? You still have a lot to learn." The rest of the afternoon focused on more advanced techniques. Brandon proved to be a dedicated and respectful student, reminding Margaret of her own early days in Paris. Around 5 o'clock, the bell chimed again. Margaret and Brandon looked up to see Tyler and Amber entering the atelier. "Brandon!" Tyler exclaimed. "We've been looking everywhere for you. What are you doing here?" "Learning," Brandon replied simply. Amber eyed the scene suspiciously. "Learning what?" "Ms. Wilson, can we talk about that partnership?" she asked, ignoring Brandon. Margaret noted the stark contrast between their approach and Brandon's. "Of course, we can talk," she said. "But first, would you like to see what Brandon learned today?" Tyler and Amber exchanged impatient glances but agreed. Brandon proudly demonstrated some of the stitches he'd mastered, explaining the techniques Margaret had taught him. "Very nice," Amber said without enthusiasm. "But what about business? We brought some ideas." "What ideas?" Margaret asked. Tyler opened a folder he'd brought. "We were thinking of a premium clothing line. With your expertise and our marketing connections, we could make serious money," he said excitedly. "And how would the split work?" Margaret asked. "Well, since we'd handle the business side, which is the hardest part, we were thinking 60% for us, 40% for you," Amber said, as if doing her a favor. Brandon nearly choked. "60% for you?" he repeated in disbelief. "You don't even know how to sew." "The creative and operational part is our responsibility," said Tyler defensively. "Mrs. Wilson would only need to execute." Margaret observed the discussion with interest. This was exactly what she had expected. "And if I refused the proposal?" she asked calmly. "Well," Tyler hesitated. "You'd miss a great opportunity to expand your business." "My business," Margaret repeated. "What business?" Amber grew irritated. "Mrs. Wilson, we know you have money," she said bluntly. "We saw it on your phone last Friday. No need to pretend you're just some simple seamstress." "Oh," Margaret said, nodding. "And does that change anything?" "It changes everything," Tyler exclaimed. "If you have capital to invest, we could do something much bigger." "Like what?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious to see how far they'd go. "We could open a factory," Amber said excitedly. "You put up the money, we handle everything, and we split the profits." Brandon was red with embarrassment. "You two don't even realize what you're saying," he muttered. Margaret stood and walked to her desk, picking up some of the photos she had shown Brandon earlier. "You want to know who I am?" she asked calmly. Tyler and Amber nodded eagerly. Margaret spread the photos across the table, images of her in Paris, at fashion shows with international celebrities. "That was me 30 years ago," she said, "in the top haute couture ateliers of Paris." The two young people took the photos, eyes wide. "You're famous?" Amber asked. "I was, but I chose to return to the United States and live a simpler life," Margaret explained. "But why?" Tyler asked, disbelieving. "You could have stayed rich and famous." Margaret smiled. "Who says I didn't get rich?" She went to her computer and pulled up several web pages, showing articles about innovative sewing techniques. In each one, there were references to methods patented by a Brazilian specialist. "These techniques you're seeing," she said, "all developed by me and licensed to practically the entire global fashion industry." Tyler and Amber were speechless. "The royalties from these patents allow me to live comfortably without worrying about money," Margaret continued, "and to use my resources to help others." "Help how?" Amber asked, still processing the information. Margaret opened another tab, showing the website of a sewing school. "This school in Southside, it graduated 200 seamstresses last year," she said. "I fund it." She opened more tabs, showing other schools in different states. 12 schools in total, all offering free sewing and fashion design courses for low-income youth, Margaret explained. Brandon was moved, but Tyler and Amber looked more confused than impressed. But you could be making so much more money, Tyler said. Why stay here in this small shop? Because here, I can make a real difference, Margaret replied. Meeting people like the three of you, for example. What do you mean? Amber asked. You were a test, Margaret said simply. I use situations like this to evaluate people's character, Tyler flushed. A test? He repeated. Brandon passed, Margaret said, smiling at the young man. He showed humility, a willingness to learn, and the ability to admit his mistakes. And us? Amber asked, though she already knew the answer. You showed exactly the kind of mindset I try to avoid, Margaret said honestly. Only caring about money, disrespecting those you saw as beneath you, and making proposals that disproportionately benefit yourselves. The two fell silent, clearly ashamed. But you're young, Margaret continued. You can still learn and change, if you're genuinely interested. How? Asked Tyler, now more humble. Start by doing volunteer work at one of my schools, suggested Margaret. No pay, just helping and learning. If after 3 months you're still interested, we can talk about real opportunities. Amber and Tyler exchanged glances. Volunteer work? Repeated Amber. But we have bills to pay. Then keep your current jobs and volunteer in your free time, said Margaret. If you truly want to learn about fashion and business, this would be a great opportunity. And if we do this, would you consider hiring us or something? Asked Tyler. Margaret shook her head. You still don't understand, she said patiently. It's not about being hired by me. It's about learning to make a difference in people's lives through your work. Brandon nodded, fully understanding. Like my grandma always did, he murmured. Exactly like your grandma did, Margaret confirmed. Tyler and Amber seemed to be wrestling internally with the offer. It was clear they'd expected something very different. We'll think about it, Amber finally said. Of course, said Margaret. No rush, but know this offer only stands if it's made sincerely. The two quickly said goodbye and left, leaving Margaret and Brandon alone in the studio. They won't come back, will they? Asked Brandon. Probably not, Margaret admitted. At least not for the right reasons. What about me? Can I still come here? Brandon asked hopefully. Margaret smiled. Not only can you should. In fact, I have a proposal for you. What proposal? Brandon asked curiously. How about becoming my official assistant? Margaret suggested. You could help me here in the studio during the day and at the schools a few times a week. Brandon was stunned. Are you serious? Completely, Margaret confirmed. Of course, there'd be proper pay, and you'd learn every aspect of the business. But I barely know how to sew properly, Brandon protested. That can be learned, said Margaret. What can't be taught is character, and you've shown you have plenty of that. Brandon was too emotional to speak. Margaret continued. Besides, I have a special project in mind. A new school, right here in Chicago. So I'll need someone to help me organize it. A new school? Brandon asked, collecting himself. In Wicker Park, Margaret explained. A bigger space with modern equipment. For young people like you, who have potential but need an opportunity. Brandon was silent for a moment, taking it all in. Can I ask you something? He finally said. Of course, Margaret replied. Why are you doing all this? I mean, you already have money, international recognition. Why care about people like me? Margaret sat in her chair and looked out the window before answering. You know, Brandon, when I was young like you, a teacher in Paris asked me the same thing. Why did Madame Collins care about me, a poor seamstress from the United States? What was her answer? Brandon asked. She told me talent has no nationality, social class or skin color, Margaret said, and that our duty, when we have the ability to help, is to find that talent and give it opportunities. Brandon nodded in understanding. It's a cycle, Margaret continued. Someone helped me, now I help others, and one day you'll help others too. That's how the world improves, one person at a time. Do you really think I have that talent? Brandon asked timidly. I'm certain of it, Margaret said firmly. Not just for sewing, but for understanding people. That's rare and valuable. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing, the following week Brandon officially began as Margaret's assistant. His mornings were dedicated to learning sewing techniques and managing the atelier, while his afternoons were spent visiting schools and getting to know the ongoing projects. Margaret was impressed by how quickly Brandon absorbed not just the techniques, but also the philosophy behind the work. He showed a natural sensitivity for identifying students with potential and endless patience for teaching the basics. During one of these school visits in Southside, Brandon met Ms. Dorothy, a 72-year-old woman who had enrolled to learn sewing. "Ms. Dorothy," Brandon said curiously, "don't you think you're a bit experienced to start now?" She laughed. "My dear, I learned to sew at 12, but I never had the chance to improve my skills," she explained. "Now that I've raised my children and grandchildren, I can finally study properly." Margaret, who had been observing the conversation, stepped closer. "Miss Dorothy has been here for 3 months and is already one of the best students," she remarked. "Miss Margaret has worked miracles here," Miss Dorothy said, referring to the local coordinator. "Young people who were lost now have a profession, and folks like me can fulfill old dreams." Brandon was moved by her words. On the way back to the atelier, he said to Margaret, "I never thought sewing could change people's lives so much." "It's not just the sewing itself," Margaret explained. "It's the opportunity, the self-esteem, the financial independence that comes with a skill. Like your grandmother's case," she added. "I bet through sewing she didn't just support her family, but also felt useful and valued." Brandon nodded, emotional. "She always said every stitch was a step toward the future," he recalled. 2 weeks later, Margaret received an unexpected call. It was Amber. "Ms. Wilson." Her voice sounded different, more humble. "Could I talk to you?" "Of course, Amber." "What's happened?" Margaret asked. "Well, Tyler and I have been thinking about what you said," she hesitated, "about the volunteer work." "Oh," Margaret said, genuinely surprised. "And did you reach any conclusion?" "We'd like to try," Amber said, "if the offer still stands." Margaret was intrigued. She hadn't expected them to come back, especially not like this. "Of course it still stands," she replied. "But may I ask what changed your minds?" Amber paused before answering. "Actually, it was something that happened at work," she explained. "Tyler and I work at a digital marketing agency, and last week a client fired us in a really humiliating way." "I'm sorry," Margaret said sincerely. "She said we were shallow and didn't understand the real value of work," Amber continued. "And, well, it reminded me of what happened with you." Margaret understood. "And you realized she might have been right?" she asked gently. "Exactly," Amber admitted. "We've been treating people like objects to get what we want, and that's not right." "It's an important first step to recognize that," Margaret said. "And Tyler, does he feel the same?" "Yes, we're in this together," Amber confirmed. "We'd really like a second chance." Margaret considered carefully. Her experience had taught her to be cautious, but she also believed in second chances for those who showed genuine change. "All right," she finally said, "but this time, the rules will be clear from the start." "What rules?" Amber asked. "First, you'll start by helping with cleaning and organizing at the school in Wicker Park," explained Margaret. "Nothing glamorous, just basic work." "Got it," agreed Amber. "Second, there's no guarantee of a job or business opportunity at the end," continued Margaret. "The goal is just to learn and help." "Understood," said Amber. "And third, any sign that you're there just for your own interests, and the opportunity ends immediately," Margaret finished. "We understand," Amber replied, "and we accept all the conditions." "Then you can start on Monday," said Margaret. "Brandon will explain the details." After hanging up, Margaret told Brandon about the conversation. "They came back?" he asked, surprised. "Apparently so," Margaret confirmed. "What do you think?" Brandon thought for a moment. "I think everyone deserves a second chance," he said, "and if it doesn't work out, at least we tried." "Exactly what I thought," Margaret agreed. The following Monday, Tyler and Amber showed up at the school in Wicker Park. Brandon was there to welcome them and explain their tasks. The change in their demeanor was noticeable. They wore simple clothes and arrived humbly, ready to work. "What do you want us to do?" asked Tyler. "For now, you'll help organize teaching materials," Brandon explained. "Sort fabrics, arrange threads by color, that kind of thing." For the first few hours, Tyler and Amber worked quietly, clearly out of their comfort zone. But gradually they began interacting with the students and understanding the environment better. "Wow," Amber remarked during lunch. "These women are amazing. Ms. Martha over there is learning to sew at 55 to start a small business. And Marcus," Tyler added, referring to a 19-year-old, "he says before coming here he was involved in some bad stuff. Now he wants to be a fashion designer." Brandon smiled, pleased to see they were starting to grasp the project's true value. "Margaret always says we don't just teach sewing techniques here," he commented. "We offer opportunities for transformation." "Brandon," Amber said hesitantly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," he replied. "Do you regret turning down our initial proposal?" she asked. "I mean, now you probably earn less than you would have as our partner." Brandon laughed. "Amber, I've never been happier in my life," he said honestly. "I wake up every day knowing I'll learn something new and help people. That's priceless." Tyler nodded thoughtfully. "I guess we never stopped to think about that," he admitted. "It was always just about money and status." "And now?" Brandon asked. "Now I'm starting to realize maybe we had the wrong priorities," Tyler said. The following weeks passed with Tyler and Amber genuinely dedicating themselves to volunteer work. Margaret observed them discreetly, noting gradual changes in their behavior and attitude. One day, Amber arrived early at the school and found Margaret talking with the local coordinator. "Ms. Wilson," she said, approaching respectfully, "can I talk to you?" "Of course, Amber," Margaret replied. "What is it?" "It's about one of the students, Jennifer," Amber said. "She told me she's struggling to afford materials to finish the course." Margaret nodded, already aware of the situation. "And I was thinking," Amber continued hesitantly, "could I help? I mean, buy the materials for her?" Margaret was surprised. It was the first time Amber had taken the initiative to help someone without being asked. "That's a very generous gesture," Margaret said. "But are you sure you can do this?" "I have some savings," Amber replied. "And, well, after hearing her story, it feels like the right thing to do." Margaret smiled, seeing the genuine transformation in the young woman. "Then let's talk to Jennifer together," she said. Jennifer, a 35-year-old woman trying to rebuild her life after a difficult divorce, was moved by Amber's offer. "You barely even know me," she said with tears in her eyes. "Why would you do this for me?" "Because I know what it's like to feel lost," Amber replied sincerely. "And if I can help someone not give up on their dreams, it's worth it." Margaret watched the scene with satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of transformation she had hoped to see. A few weeks later, Tyler also showed significant change. He had grown closer to Marcus, the 19-year-old, and discovered the young man had exceptional talent for design, but no access to a computer to develop his ideas. "Ms. Wilson," Tyler said during a conversation in the studio, "can I suggest something?" "Of course," Margaret replied. "Marcus has amazing ideas for prints and designs," Tyler explained, "but he draws everything by hand because he doesn't have a computer, and I have an old computer at home I don't use anymore." "You want to give it to him?" Margaret asked. "If you think it's appropriate," Tyler said, "and maybe I could teach him how to use some design programs I know." Margaret was impressed. Tyler wasn't just offering equipment, but also his time and knowledge. "I think it's an excellent idea," she said. "Marcus will be thrilled." And he was. When Tyler arrived at the school with the computer and offered to teach digital design classes, Marcus nearly cried with joy. "I can't believe you're doing this for me," he said. "Man, you have incredible talent," Tyler replied. "It'd be wrong to leave you without the tools to develop it." Margaret was present during this conversation and was moved to see Tyler's complete transformation. The arrogant young man who had mocked her sewing machine was now dedicating his skills to help others. 3 months after the volunteer work began, Margaret invited Tyler and Amber for a private conversation in her studio. "Well," she said as the three of them sat down, "the period we agreed on has come to an end. The two young people tensed, unsure what to expect. "And?" Amber asked nervously. "And you've surprised me," Margaret said with a smile. "Your transformation has been genuine and impressive." Tyler and Amber sighed in relief. "Does that mean?" Tyler began. "It means we can now talk about real opportunities," Margaret said, "but not the kind you originally imagined." "What do you mean?" Amber asked. Margaret stood and walked to her desk, picking up some documents. "I'm expanding the school project," she explained, "and I need people to manage specific aspects." She handed them the papers to read. "Amber, you've shown a natural talent for connecting with students and understanding their needs," Margaret said. "I'd like you to consider becoming the student wellness coordinator." Amber stared at the document wide-eyed. "Coordinator," she repeated. "You'd be responsible for identifying students who need extra support, coordinating assistance programs, and developing activities to build self-esteem," Margaret explained. "What about me?" Tyler asked eagerly. "Tyler, your digital marketing skills could be used to promote the schools and showcase graduates' work," Margaret said. "How about social media and marketing coordinator?" Tyler was speechless. "You're offering us jobs?" he finally asked. "I'm offering you the chance to use your skills to make a difference," Margaret corrected. "With fair salaries, of course, but the main focus would be on social impact." The two young people exchanged glances, clearly moved. "We accept," Amber said quickly. "Are you sure?" Margaret asked. "It won't be easy work, and it definitely won't make you rich." "Ms. Wilson," Tyler said seriously, "in the last 3 months I've learned more about personal fulfillment than in my entire life. If I can have that and still earn a living, it's more than I could ask for." "And I've never felt so useful," Amber added. "When I see the progress of the students, it's indescribable." Margaret smiled, pleased. "Then welcome officially to the team," she said. Brandon, who had been observing the whole conversation, stepped forward to greet the new colleagues. "Man, what a journey," he said to Tyler. "I remember when you first got here." "We were unbearable," Tyler admitted sheepishly. "Young and immature," Margaret corrected. "But you had potential. You just needed the right guidance. And a lesson in humility," Amber added with a laugh. In the following months, the team worked harmoniously on expanding the projects. Amber developed innovative support programs for the students, including daycare for mothers who wanted to study and support groups for women who had faced difficult situations. Tyler created a communication strategy that brought the graduates' work national visibility. Several alumni secured jobs at major companies or started their own businesses thanks to the exposure he achieved. Brandon continued to grow as Margaret's assistant, learning not just about sewing, but also about managing social projects and community development. One day, nearly a year after first meeting the three young people, Margaret received an unexpected visitor. It was an elegant woman around 70 years old, accompanied by a team of assistants. "Professor Margaret Wilson?" the woman asked. "Yes, that's me," Margaret replied, intrigued. "My name is Eleanor Thompson," the visitor said. "I'm from the International Textile Development Foundation." Margaret knew the foundation by reputation. It was a respected organization promoting innovation and education in the global textile industry. "How can I help you?" Margaret asked. "Actually, we came here to talk about you," Eleanor said with a smile. "We're organizing a World Congress on textile innovation, and we'd love for you to be our keynote speaker." Margaret was surprised. "Keynote speaker," she repeated. "Professor Wilson, your work hasn't gone unnoticed," Eleanor explained. "Your patented techniques have revolutionized the industry, and now your educational projects are serving as a model for other countries." "How so?" Margaret asked. Eleanor opened a folder and showed several international articles. "Schools like yours are opening in Canada, Mexico, and even France," she said, "based on the model you developed." Margaret looked at the articles in awe. She had no idea her work had reached such a scale. "Where would the Congress be held?" she asked. "In Paris," Eleanor replied, "at the same institute where you studied decades ago." Margaret smiled at that. It would be a symbolic return to where it all began. "And would it just be a speech?" she asked. "Actually, we'd like you to present your entire educational project," Eleanor explained. It has the potential to be implemented globally. Margaret considered the offer. It was an opportunity to expand her work's reach even further. "Can I bring my team?" she asked. "Of course," Eleanor replied enthusiastically. "In fact, it would be ideal if we could meet the people helping you develop these projects." Margaret looked at Brandon, Tyler, and Amber, who had stepped closer during the conversation. "Then I accept," she said. "It will be an honor to represent our work in Paris." Eleanor smiled with satisfaction. "Excellent. The conference will be in 2 months," she said. "We'll email all the details." After the delegation left, the team grew excited about the upcoming trip. "We're going to Paris," Amber exclaimed. "Not just Paris," corrected Margaret. "We're taking our work to the world." "Ms. Wilson," Brandon said emotionally, "do you realize what you've achieved? You started by helping a few people here in the United States, and now you'll inspire projects worldwide." Margaret smiled modestly. "Brandon, this isn't my doing," she replied. "It's the result of our entire team's work and every student who passes through our schools." "But you were the one who started it all," Tyler insisted. "I did begin it," Margaret admitted, "but it's you who will carry it forward and expand it when I'm no longer here." The team grew thoughtful at her remark. "Are you thinking of retiring?" Amber asked worriedly. "Not exactly," Margaret answered, "but at 65, I need to start considering succession, and the 3 of you are the natural candidates to lead this work forward." "But we still have so much to learn," Brandon protested. "And you will," Margaret assured him, "but you've already shown what matters most, a genuine desire to help others." The 2 weeks before the Paris trip were intense. The team carefully prepared their presentation, documenting every aspect of their educational projects. Margaret decided to bring along some of the school's most talented students to showcase their work. Among them were Marcus with his digital designs, Jennifer, who had become an expert in children's sewing, and Ms. Dorothy, who at 72 had become a volunteer teacher at the Southside School. The trip to Paris was thrilling for everyone. For Margaret, it was a nostalgic return to where her career had begun. For the others, it was their first time leaving the country. The conference was an absolute success. Margaret's presentation on the U.S. educational model received a standing ovation, and several international organizations expressed interest in implementing similar projects in their countries. During a dinner on the conference's final day, Eleanor Thompson made a special announcement. "Professor Wilson," she said, standing to speak, "on behalf of the International Textile Development Foundation, we'd like to offer you the title of Global Ambassador for Textile Education." Margaret was moved by the honor. "It's a well-deserved recognition," Eleanor continued. "Your work has already transformed thousands of lives in the United States and will now inspire projects in dozens of countries." The award ceremony was emotional. Margaret received a commemorative plaque and a promise of international support to expand her projects further. During her acceptance speech, she made sure to call Brandon, Tyler, and Amber to the stage. "This recognition isn't just mine," she said. "It belongs to an entire dedicated team who believes in the transformative power of education. And most of all, it belongs to every student who dared to seek an opportunity for change." The audience applauded warmly as the team embraced on stage, overcome with emotion. Back in the United States, the team returned to work with renewed energy. The international recognition had brought new funding opportunities and partnerships. A few weeks after returning from Paris, Margaret was in her studio when she received a surprising phone call from a national television program. "Professor Wilson," the producer said, "we'd like to do a special feature on your work." "A feature?" Margaret asked, always hesitant about media attention. "Yes, about the seamstress who became a global ambassador," the producer explained. "The story is already making waves on social media." Margaret sighed. She had no idea the news had reached the United States with such force. "Would it be possible to focus the story on the work of the schools and students?" she asked. "I wouldn't want to be the main focus." "Of course," agreed the producer. "In fact, it would be even more interesting to show the project's impact on the communities." The report aired 2 weeks later and caused a national stir. The program traced Margaret's journey from her small atelier to international recognition, but focused mainly on the students and alumni of the schools. Marcus appeared, showing his evolution from an at-risk youth to a promising designer. Jennifer shared how she had rebuilt her life through sewing. Ms. Dorothy moved the nation as she spoke about fulfilling a dream at 72. The response was immediate. The schools received hundreds of calls from people eager to enroll. Companies offered partnerships and donations. Politicians reached out to Margaret to discuss expanding the model to other states. But perhaps the most emotional call came from an 80-year-old woman in Miami. "Professor Margaret," said the trembling voice, "my name is Betty Parker." Margaret nearly dropped the phone. "Did you say Betty Parker?" she asked. "Yes, my dear," the woman confirmed. "I saw on TV that there's a young man working with you, Brandon. He mentioned his grandmother." Margaret understood immediately. "You're Brandon's grandmother?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I was, dear. Betty Parker," the woman said. "But I didn't pass away. There must have been some confusion." Margaret was stunned. Brandon always spoke of his grandmother in the past tense, as if she were gone. "Grandma Betty, could you hold on a moment?" Margaret asked. "I'll get Brandon." When Brandon picked up the phone and heard his grandmother's voice, he burst into tears. "Grandma," he said in disbelief, "but I thought that I was gone?" Grandma Betty asked. "No, my boy. I just left Chicago 3 years ago to live with your aunt in Miami. Didn't you get my letters?" Brandon realized the misunderstanding. His mother had told him his grandmother was resting, and he had misinterpreted it. "Grandma, I'm so sorry," he said through tears. "I thought I'd lost you." "Nonsense, my child," Grandma Betty said warmly. "And how proud I am to see you on TV, working with this wonderful teacher, helping so many people." Margaret, who had been listening, stepped closer to the phone. "Grandma Betty," she said, "this is Margaret. I'd love to meet you in person." "It would be an honor, Professor," Grandma Betty replied. "Actually, I was wondering, might there be a little spot for an old seamstress at your school?" Margaret smiled. "There's always room for those who want to teach and learn," she said. A week later, Grandma Betty arrived in Chicago. The reunion with Brandon was emotional, and she was immediately welcomed as a volunteer teacher. "You know, Professor Margaret," Grandma Betty said during her first days at the school, "my grandson told me your whole story. You're proof of how to make a difference with humility." "Grandma Betty, you're the one who's an example," Margaret replied. "You raised a young man with a heart as big as the world." Grandma Betty's arrival brought a special energy to the school. Her decades of experience as a seamstress, combined with her wisdom, made her a beloved teacher among all the students. One day, as Margaret watched Grandma Betty teach traditional stitches to a group of young students, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. It had all started with 3 arrogant young men mocking her dinosaur sewing machine. Now one of them had become her right hand, the other 2 had discovered the value of social work, and together they were impacting lives around the world. Brandon approached, noticing her thoughtful expression. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How surprising life can be," replied Margaret. "That day you all walked in here seemed like just another small adjustment job. Who could have imagined it would lead to all this?" "Did you know you were going to test us?" asked Brandon. "I knew I'd be observing your character," admitted Margaret. "But even I didn't imagine the transformation would be so complete or go this far." "And now?" asked Brandon. "What's the next step?" Margaret smiled. "Now you're ready to fly on your own," she said. "It's time for me to start stepping back gradually and let you take the lead." Brandon looked worried. "But we still need you," he protested. "You need my experience, not my constant presence," corrected Margaret. "And it's time for you to trust yourselves." That evening, Margaret organized a special meeting with the entire core team. Brandon, Tyler, Amber, and now Grandma Betty, too, gathered in her atelier. "I have an announcement to make," said Margaret once everyone settled in. The group listened attentively. "I've decided it's time to formalize the leadership transition," she announced. "Brandon will take over as General Director of the Educational Projects." Brandon was speechless. "Tyler will be the Director of Communications and Partnerships," continued Margaret. "Amber will assume the role of Director of Human and Social Development." The 3 young adults were too emotional to speak. "And Grandma Betty will be our Senior Advisor and Pedagogical Supervisor," Margaret concluded. But what about you? Asked Amber. I'll remain as founder and strategic consultant, explained Margaret, but the day-to-day will be your responsibility. Ms. Wilson, said Brandon, moved. Are you sure we're ready? I'm absolutely certain, Margaret replied firmly. You've already demonstrated the technical skills and, more importantly, the vision and values needed to carry this work forward. Tyler, who had stayed quiet, finally spoke. Ms. Wilson, I just wanted to say that, well, you completely changed our lives, he said, his voice breaking. When I think about the kind of person I was a year ago. You changed your own lives, Margaret interrupted. I just provided the opportunity. You made the right choices. And now we'll honor that opportunity, said Amber determinedly. 6 months later, the transition was complete. Brandon had become a natural leader, respected by both students and institutional partners. Tyler had developed a communication strategy that kept the projects growing steadily. Amber had created psychosocial support programs that became a national benchmark. Margaret remained involved, but now as a mentor and advisor, appearing when needed while letting the new leadership make day-to-day decisions. On a quiet afternoon, she was in her atelier, working on a special piece when Brandon appeared. Ms. Wilson, I have news, he said excitedly. What news? She asked, looking up from her work. The International Foundation approved our proposal, Brandon announced. We're opening schools in Mexico and Canada over the next 2 years. Margaret smiled proudly. That's wonderful news, she said. And do you feel prepared for this expansion? With your guidance, yes, replied Brandon, but mostly because we've learned that the secret isn't in the methods or equipment. It's in genuinely caring about people. Exactly, agreed Margaret, and that's something you've already mastered perfectly. Brandon approached the table where Margaret was working. What are you working on? He asked. Margaret smiled mysteriously. It's a surprise, she said, for the grand opening of the national headquarters of the schools. What kind of surprise? Brandon pressed. You'll have to wait, Margaret teased. In truth, Margaret was preparing a special exhibition for the opening. She had selected pieces created by students over the years, from simple early works to sophisticated creations that rivaled designer brands. The exhibition would visually showcase the growth and evolution of the educational programs. Each piece would tell the story of its creator's transformation. The grand opening of the new headquarters took place 3 months later at an event that brought together officials, business leaders, alumni, and the wider community. The chosen location was a refurbished industrial warehouse in Wicker Park, renovated specifically to house the main school and serve as the coordination center for all branches. When Margaret unveiled the exhibition, everyone was amazed. The pieces were arranged chronologically, displaying the students' technical and artistic progress. Plaques briefly told each creator's story. This exhibition is living proof that talent knows no social class, Margaret said during her opening speech. Every piece here represents not just refined skill, but dreams fulfilled and lives transformed. The event was covered by several media outlets and officially marked the project's consolidation as a nationally recognized institution for vocational education. During the celebration, Margaret watched with satisfaction as alumni, current staff, officials, and newcomers mingled. It was exactly the sense of community she had always dreamed of creating. Professor Margaret, a voice called from behind her. She turned and saw Marcus, the young designer Tyler had helped with the computer. Now he was dressed elegantly and accompanied by a young woman. Marcus, Margaret exclaimed happily. How are you? Very well, Professor, he replied with a smile. I wanted to introduce my fiancée, Stephanie, and to tell you I've received a scholarship to study design in Europe. Margaret was moved. What wonderful news, she said. When do you leave? Next semester, Marcus said. But first I wanted to thank you and Tyler for everything you did for me. Without you, I'd still be lost. Marcus, the credit is all yours, Margaret said. We just provided the tools. You did the work. Even so, I'll always be grateful, Marcus insisted. And when I return from Europe, I want to start my own brand here in the United States and hire other young people like I once was. That's the right attitude, Margaret said proudly. The cycle continues. Later, during the celebration, Margaret was approached by a well-dressed, middle-aged man. "Professor Margaret," he said, "my name is William Roberts. I'm the director of a major department store chain." "Pleasure to meet you, William," Margaret replied. "I came because I'm impressed by your work," William said, "and I have a proposal that might interest you." "What kind of proposal?" Margaret asked. "We'd like to create an exclusive clothing line entirely produced by graduates of your schools," William explained, "with fair prices for consumers and a good profit margin for the producers." Margaret was intrigued. "That's an interesting idea," she said, "but it would have to truly benefit our students, not just our reputation." "Exactly what we had in mind," William agreed. "It would ensure a market for graduates while offering quality products to our customers." "May I introduce you to Brandon?" Margaret suggested. "He oversees these kinds of partnerships now." The conversation between William and Brandon was productive. In just a few weeks, they developed a pilot project to be tested in a few stores before a possible nationwide expansion. The first clothing line, produced by the graduates of the schools, was launched 6 months later and was an immediate success. The pieces had superior quality and competitive prices, and consumers felt good, knowing they were supporting a social project. The success of the commercial line generated additional resources that allowed for the opening of new schools in other regions of the country. The project, which had started with Margaret in her small atelier, now spanned several states and countries. A year after the national headquarters opened, Margaret was at home resting when she received a call from Ashley, her administrative assistant. "Mrs. Wilson, I have some news I think you'll be interested in," Ashley said excitedly. "What news?" Margaret asked. "Do you remember those 2 young people who mocked you 2 years ago? Tyler and Amber?" Ashley asked. "Of course I remember," Margaret replied. "Why?" "They just won a national award for social responsibility," Ashley announced, "for the work they developed here in the schools." Margaret smiled proudly. "How wonderful," she said. "They truly deserve it." "And there's more," Ashley continued. "In the interview they gave after receiving the award, they told the whole story. How arrogant they were, how you changed them, everything." "Oh, really?" Margaret said, curious. "The segment will air tonight on the national news," Ashley said. "Would you like me to record it?" "Yes, please do," Margaret replied. "It'll be interesting to hear their perspective on everything that happened." That evening, Margaret watched the segment with Grandma Betty and Brandon. The interview with Tyler and Amber was moving. "We were completely different people 2 years ago," Amber told the reporter. "Superficial, prejudiced, only interested in money." "And how did you change?" the journalist asked. "We met a very special teacher," Tyler answered. "She showed us that true success isn't measured by how much you have, but by how much good you do." "Are you referring to Professor Margaret Wilson?" the reporter asked. "Yes," Amber confirmed. "She could have simply ignored us or kicked us out when we were disrespectful, but she chose to give us a second chance." "And what did you learn from this experience?" the journalist pressed. "That appearances can be deceiving," Tyler said. "We judged Professor Wilson by the humble appearance of her atelier. We had no idea we were standing before one of the most influential people in the global textile industry." "More than that," Amber added, "we learned that true wealth lies in being able to help others achieve their dreams." Margaret was moved watching the interview. Seeing Tyler and Amber speak so sincerely about their transformation was deeply rewarding. "What a proud moment, Mrs. Wilson," Grandma Betty remarked. "You truly changed those young people's lives." "We changed each other," Margaret corrected. "They taught me as much as I taught them." "How so?" Brandon asked. "They reminded me of the importance of always giving second chances," Margaret explained. "And they showed me that genuine transformation is possible when there's goodwill on both sides." A few weeks after the segment aired, Margaret received hundreds of messages from people across the country. Many were from young people who identified with Tyler and Amber's story and wanted an opportunity for change. Others were from business owners offering support for the projects. But the message that touched her most came from a retired seamstress in Denver. "Professor Wilson, I watched the segment and cried with emotion. I'm 70 years old and worked my whole life as a seamstress. I always dreamed that our profession would be valued and respected. You made this dream come true. Thank you for dignifying our craft and showing the world that seamstresses can change the world. Margaret kept this message in a special place. It was confirmation that her work had truly made a difference, not just for her direct students, but for an entire profession often underestimated. 2 years later, during a graduation ceremony for another class from the schools, Margaret made a special announcement. "Dear graduates, families, and team," she said into the microphone, "today is a very special day for me." The audience listened intently, not just because you're graduating, but because I'm officially stepping down as director of the projects. A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. "At 67, I feel I've fulfilled my mission," she continued. "I leave this work in the capable hands of the team we've built over the years." Brandon, Tyler, and Amber sat in the front row, visibly moved. "But don't worry," Margaret said with a smile. "I won't disappear. I'll still be here as an advisor and mentor whenever needed." She added, "And I plan to return to what I love most, sewing in my little studio and welcoming young people who want to learn the foundations of the craft." The ceremony ended with a standing ovation for Margaret. After the celebration, she returned to her original studio, kept exactly as it had been the day Tyler, Amber, and Brandon first walked in. Her white sewing machine was still there, working perfectly. Margaret sat in her familiar chair and began working on a new piece, feeling the satisfaction of returning to her roots. The following week, the bell rang just like in the old days. Margaret looked up and saw 3 young people standing at the entrance. 2 young men and a woman, all dressed in expensive clothes with expressions mixing haste and poorly concealed disdain. Margaret smiled. The cycle was beginning again. "Good afternoon," she said calmly. "How can I help you?" And so, in the quiet of her small studio, Margaret continued doing what she had always done, sewing dreams one person at a time, proving once again that appearances can be deceiving, and that true wealth lies in the ability to transform lives through work done with love and dedication. Her legacy was secured not just through the schools around the world, but most of all through the hundreds of lives she had touched and changed. With each new day, with each new person who entered her studio, she kept planting seeds of transformation that would bloom for generations. The sewing machine kept running just like the generous heart of a woman who proved it's possible to change the world, one person at a time, with patience, wisdom, and a whole lot of love. Ladies, now tell us what you thought of this story. If you were moved by Margaret's transformation and the young people's journey, share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe second chances can truly change people? Share your experience. Thank you so much for joining us on this touching journey. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories.